Okay, stop. So, hello everybody. Today I have the immense and great pleasure to have a conversation with Scott Horton. Scott, thank you very much to take time to talk with me today.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Let me present Scott. Okay. So, if you don't know who is Scott Horton, you're really missing something. Scott is the director of Antiwar.com and also the director of the Libertarian Institute. He's the host of the Scott Horton Show and Antiwar Radio. As you can see behind Scott, there's a lot of books. Some of them, he's the author of some of those books. I'll mention the four more important that are Full Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, The Great Ron Paul, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Scott has performed over 5,000 interviews, including with Dr. Ron Paul, which is a great hero for the libertarian movement. He also recently had an interview with Daryl Cooper. Daryl Cooper had previously been interviewed by Tucker Carlson, which had reached probably millions of people, and that show was that show really traumatized the internet, which is absolutely wonderful, I think. Scott made a debate 3 years ago with Bill Kristol, a neocon that was, I think, behind the war in Iraq. And Scott obviously won the debate. You have to absolutely watch that. That was delicious. So now, just before we start, I want to make a little disclaimer and explain my goal for that. Me and Scott, we're from the libertarian perspective. We're not a sympathizer of Nazism or Hitler. So just to understand that, because when we talk about World War II and disagree with the official narrative, often people will tell, oh, but you're probably a Nazi. No, that's very stupid thinking, but we're used to it. So my goal with these interviews is to bring the maximum arguments to debunk the myth of World War II. And I'm open to get even arguments that are not from a libertarian perspective. If you are, from people that are leftist, pacifist, I'm really open to that. Because I think that the myth of World War II is really, I think, a plague for our world today. And I see three major reasons why World War II needs to be debunked. First, and the biggest point is that World War II has been used since 1945 to sell a lot of probably all of them, a lot of unjustified wars. And still today it is used. And right now we are at a point where a war with Russia and China could mean the end of mankind. And I think just for that, it's why I don't care if you're anti-war, but you're not a libertarian. If at least you agree with us that war can end our life, I prefer to be alive under a system where I pay tax for universal health care than being turned to ashes. So I also think that the myth of World War II is also used to sell state interventionism in every sphere. And finally, I think that the myth of World War II is very essential to what we call, all the identity politics, the woke cultural Marxism and postmodernism. Because for the woke leftists, it seems to them that the Nazis were not evil because they were imperialist, they had conscription, state intervention in the economy, and that they put people into concentration camps. No, for the woke, it seems to me that the Nazis were evil because because of the reason that put people into concentration camps, which were about identity politics, because for them, putting libertarian in concentration camp would probably be fine, but putting people because they are Jews, gay, black, that's terrible. And so so I think that for me, that's my passion in life. So now, so the question I'm asking Scott today is that if I said that World War II was not a good war, and it would have been better to not intervene. I want you, Scott, to tell us why you think, why you agree with me on that. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think I do agree with you on that. It's obviously a massive and complicated subject. It's also one that I have not been studying recently, right? As you mentioned, this came up because Daryl Cooper got himself in trouble by sort of broaching the topic, or I think it was Tucker that brought it up. And so they sort of touched on a little World War II revisionism and then skated off again, talking about other things. And they weren't able really to wrap up the conversation. And so Daryl was made to look like a bad guy by bad guys who are after Tucker Carlson and are after Donald Trump. You know, they came out the next day and said, J.D. Vance must denounce Tucker Carlson for interviewing this guy that said this thing. Right. And then, but meanwhile, nothing that Daryl said was wrong or mean or over the line or pro-national socialism or anything like that. But that is what they wanted to hear. And so it became a big controversy, a 2 minutes hate, if you will, you know, how they do with the current thing. And he became the 2 minutes hate for about a week there, I guess, the week-long hate of the party. But he's my friend. And all the stuff that they said about him is a bunch of crap. So like, no, that's not right. So I interviewed him about it, and I'm happy to defend him here. I hope to get a chance, if I'm lucky, to maybe when the next book comes out, I'll be lucky enough to get on Tucker, and then I'll be able to defend Daryl on the Tucker show. I'd like to, because I think, you know, he didn't get defended in the same venue that he got smeared in. I mean, even the White House attacked him. The Washington Post editorial page attacked him, and all of these things.
I saw that.
Yeah. So, he deserves to be defended on this, because the fact of the matter is as you said in the introduction here, and he's not a libertarian, he's more conservative than either of us, but he's no kind of national socialist whatsoever. The guy's an American Navy veteran and an American patriot. As he joked to me, he's probably the most liberal guy in his county in Montana, where he lives now, or pardon me, in Idaho, where he lives now. He grew up poor, so he grew up around ethnic minorities of every description and is not in any way like some right-wing racial whatever thing. You know what I mean? Like they're trying to portray him as. It's just a cartoon. And then so now the problem, okay, was he offended everybody's sensibilities.
Yes.
He spit in church. Right, is what happened. Is he said something bad about Winston Churchill. And the thing is, okay, I don't know what it's like to be a French Canadian, okay? I can only tell you what it's like to be raised in Austin, Texas, and in government school in Austin, Texas, and for that matter on TV and all the movies we see and everything. World War II is pretty simple. The bad guys, the Imperial Japanese and the Nazi Germans were, as the Simpsons would say, cartoonish supervillainy beyond description. I mean, I had a great uncle who, like, I believe survived the Japanese death marches and this kind of thing. Like they treated their POWs as bad as anybody ever treated anybody's POWs. The absolute sadistic nature of the Imperial Japanese system in their empire building in Asia at that time, and the way that they fought against all of their enemies, you know, dropping bubonic plague infected fleas on Nanking. And so, I mean, World War II was insane, and our enemies were evil. And you look at FDR, saintly FDR, versus ranting, raving, insane Adolf Hitler, and they declared war on us. So that's it. You lose, dude, right? And then so the idea is essentially that's most of all of what you need to know.
Yeah.
Right? The enemy was really bad, and they needed their ass kicked by someone who was good but stronger than them. And that's our job, right? Superman, Christopher Reeves, Superman, the Boy Scout, who doesn't commit sins, but he can beat the crap out of any bad guy. He's stronger than any bad guy. That's America. And so this is the founding myth of America, and the really the birth of the American empire was in World War II. And as I've always said, that they really replaced George Washington and even Abraham Lincoln as American founders. And, you know, Lincoln's still in there somewhat. The real American founders are basically gone. But the primary founders of the American imperial system are FDR and Truman. And for that matter, Eisenhower, right? He's the Trinity because he was the Republican and the general, and he agreed and didn't repeal the New Deal when he came in, right? So this was the way, look, if you and I are in 5th grade, the way Mr. Harlow teaches this, right, is that we had to do this. This is all, by the way, long before you were born. These are things that happened in the world as it turned. And what happened was these powers rose and they fought, and then they rose again, and then they fought again. And then, but this time America came in there and made it right. Okay, so if you want to tear, and with Winston Churchill, at his urging, we finally did the right thing and saved the world. Okay, so if you want to tear that down, that's like tearing Jesus down off the cross from the civic religion. Okay, this is the foundation of America, and they don't mind knocking Jefferson off of his pedestal, but don't you lay a finger on FDR and Churchill, right? And so that was the trouble. That was the fight that Darrell was picking. He wasn't saying, you know, what's interesting about Napoleon is this, or, you know, something that Genghis Khan did in the summer campaign of whatever. No. We're talking about Hitler now. Okay, now we're talking about something that is not a matter of historical battlefields and paperwork and reading glasses. We're talking about good and evil, God and the devil, and the foundation of all that is right now based on the myth of World War II. So I'm sorry for rambling so long about that.
That's what I wanted. That's what I want.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big part of the context of what we're talking about here, is that, like, you know what, because people really are emotionally invested in this thing in a way. We've been taught in a way. I know, again, growing up as a young man in Austin, Texas public school systems, or, you know, Round Rock school system here, that, look, if people have a problem with this, it's probably because they love Hitler, because everybody else agrees.
Yeah.
Right. And also just the whole thing about you're a little kid and this all happened before you were born, that means it's inevitable. And also this is a democracy, and that means that the democracy chose the people, the grown-ups of the country. They decided, and they wouldn't have done the wrong thing. They're good people, and they did the right thing to face down the bad guy and all this. So there's so much built in to people's understanding of World War II. And Darrell himself said, you have to be careful when you tear down these sorts of foundational myths.
Yeah.
You don't know what, this could really cause more harm than good, frankly. He was willing to say himself that these myths serve a purpose. They serve bad purposes and good ones. But geez, if we're not the heroes who stopped Hitler and Tojo, who are we? I don't know. That the answer to that could be a lot of different crazy and even negative things, and things that are so contradictory that we end up not being able to figure out how to paper over some differences, and things maybe could be worse. So he's not ignorant of that. He is a real historian and knows what he's talking about. But at the same time, he's saying, like, come on, man, you're a grown man and I'm a grown man, and we're interested in what happened in the world, and we ought to be able to talk about this. Now, let me say this, as long as I'm just doing free association World War stuff here, is that when, again, government school in Texas in the 80s, you learn that World War I was really pretty bad, and we shouldn't have done that. And mostly they shouldn't have done that. Maybe if America got involved, that was Superman coming to try to save the day at the end. But certainly the Germans and the Russians and the British and the French, the Central and the Allied powers, all these empires going to war with each other, and millions of people killed with the new mechanized methods of warfare. It was just a horror show. And how, as I learned it in public school, this helped lead to the rise of Hitler. That this is part of the myth, is that there's an original sin here. See, they wouldn't want to admit that there was any cause of Hitler at all. But the cause is American isolation. Because see, what happened was America refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty, which not only punished the Germans, but it also created the League of Nations, or I forget now, maybe they're separate treaties, whatever. But the Senate refused to ratify the League of Nations treaty. Yeah. And so, see, because America was so right-wing and reactionary and isolationist and inward-looking and not engaged as the dominant military power in Europe, then that allowed Germany to rise back up and have to be destroyed again. Now, by the way, forget all that stuff I just said about how the Versailles Treaty was the cause of the reason that the people of Germany allowed this guy to come to power in the first place. We don't talk about that anymore. That's only there so that we can shame America for ever coming home from World War I, okay? But after that, we shut up about that. And we don't even talk about the fact that the communists in the East were also a huge part of the motivation for the people of Germany to promote the rise of the right, because somebody has to stop these communists. Mm-hmm. And who are meeting the communists in the street? It's the Nazis. And so people were left making really tough choices, like who do I prefer out of these raving, violent kooks? You know, the ones who are going to starve me to death or the ones who are going to shoot me in the back of the head. And so, or that could be either or. but anyway, so but so World War I saw a guy say his son asked about World War II. His young son asked about World War II. And he said, well, it was the good guys versus the bad guys, and we were the good guys, and we beat the bad guys, and everything's been great ever since. And yeah. But then he tried to explain World War I to his son. And he found that it was very difficult. Well, you see, you have this thing that was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? And you have the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire, and you know, Russia and Germany and the Schlieffen Plan and all of this stuff. And like, so what happens is that it's a big complicated mess, and there basically are no good guys, maybe until Woodrow Wilson sends in the doughboys at the end. And the Americans come. We're the only heroes in that story. But it's a complicated mess because it's not a morality tale. It's just a complicated story of imperials fighting over imperial territory and power and money and control and whatever. And so it's hard to tell the story when it's not so black and white and good and evil and easy peasy the way World War II is. But then, so a major part of, I think, libertarian foreign policy. See, and again, I don't know about how it is growing up in Quebec, okay? But around here, if you're not a hippie, then you're pro-war. Mm-hmm. If you're not a communist, then you're pro-war. If you love the American flag and you love your country, then you support your country when it fights against foreign enemies. What are you, a communist who hates America? And so that's just built in. You have to just kind of accept it. But then if you're a libertarian, that means almost always you're an American patriot. It means you know a lot about the founding fathers and the things they wrote and the what America is supposed to be about in the first place. It means you have a severe grasp of capitalist economics and the reasons why men have the right to bear arms and all of these things, right? But then you also get on to some revisionist history about the wars. Did you hear about the babies being thrown out of the incubators so Saddam Hussein could steal them? Yeah, well, that wasn't true, right? And so you start going down the list and you start going back in time and you start questioning the different wars. And you go, oh man, they really lied us into war with Mexico. And they really lied us into war with Spain. And they really lied us into war with Germany in World War I. But you know what we all do? We all skip World War II for a minute because the enemy there's Hitler, right? So we all go, that Woodrow Wilson thing. And then let me tell you, you know what? Abraham Lincoln, he actually didn't care about black people at all. He was just trying to collect his taxes and all these things, right? But then finally we get to World War II and we go, all right, well, look, we hate FDR, because of the New Deal and all of his horrible progressivism and all that. So, okay, I'm listening. And then what are you going to do? It's the true story of Pearl Harbor, okay? It's not conspiracy crap. The true story of Pearl Harbor is that FDR wanted it to happen. He deliberately implemented an 8-point plan to provoke the Japanese into attacking us. And he deliberately...
I think it's the McCollum Memo.
That's right. The McCollum Memo is what it's called. And he's a naval intelligence officer. And Robert Stinnett found this. People can read the book. It's called Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor. I've interviewed the author numerous times. He's dead now, but great guy, Robert Stinnett, who was a Navy veteran, who actually even supported FDR turning a blind eye and allowing the attack.
I know.
Because he said, he believed, because he's caught up in the mythology still, he said, if FDR hadn't lied us into war in the Pacific, then we wouldn't have had an excuse to go fight in Europe, and then the Germans would have taken over America. And it's like, well, wait a minute. How are they going to take over America if they won't even give us an excuse to fight them? We got to trick the Japanese into attacking us to have an excuse to attack them. But whatever, I'm not going to argue. I did argue the point with him for a minute, but I let it go because whatever. He's a proud Navy veteran of that war. But he goes, listen, what can I tell you? I found the codes. I found the documents. I found the thing. And then someone had stuck that McCollum Memo in the wrong place. It was in a batch of files that had nothing to do with it. And someone had apparently set it there to be found. And he found it. And they implemented it in order. Okay, like we do not have paperwork where FDR says implement the McCollum Memo. We do have history that shows he implemented it from A through H, okay, in order to provoke Japan into attacking us. And then even Robert Kagan, I have a quote of even one of the worst war party leaders of our time, Robert Kagan, admitting that America was working very hard against Japanese dominance in Asia, including, he didn't mention, but he was obviously referring to American transfers of military planes to China to fight Japan with, and all the embargoes on steel and oil and all of these things. These were the causes of the Pearl Harbor attack. Nobody ever was arguing that, like, yeah, they had the right to attack us and that was a good thing that day or whatever. But the point was, as the great historian Robert Higgs says, what they always do is they truncate the antecedents. And they go, well, World War II started when the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Kamala Harris tried to pull this the other day. You know, she literally said you have to build in the giant pregnant pause between each word because she's so unsteady and unsure of herself. But she literally did end up saying, and because we were attacked and got into that war, we were able to win that war.
Yeah.
And that's the lesson of World War II. Yeah. Anyway, so they truncate the antecedents and they pretend that, see, America was a sleeping giant, an isolationist country, minding its own business, hoping that the problems of the world would just go away, but the problems of the world just wouldn't leave us alone. And this is what she was trying to say desperately in front of Liz Cheney, was she couldn't possibly articulate. She's just trying to repeat something she heard someone else say somewhere or something. But the point that she was trying to make was the lesson of World War II is America can never come home again. America was a sleeping giant and woke up, and we'd be a damn fool to go back to sleep and think that the world will be okay. The world will not be okay if America is not in charge of it. That's the lesson of World War II that she was attempting to articulate there in front of her better Liz Cheney, which is hilarious. She's running with Liz Cheney, who supported putting the Muslim Brotherhood in power in Syria back when she worked in the State Department. People don't ever talk about that, but it's in enough already. But anyway, so we're not even talking about the war yet, really. We're talking about the politics of the understanding of the war in the minds of Americans and why it was such a big deal for Daryl to even broach this subject. Now, I want to complain for a moment here about, well, there's two more things. First of all, America declared independence from the British Empire. We call it England when we're being nice, but in 1940-41, it was called the British Empire. And America, at a time when America was literally colonies of Englishmen, primarily under the rule of the British Empire, hated it so much that they overthrew it, right? And this is before the Irish and the Germans came. This is when they were mostly Englishmen, overthrew the British Empire because they hated it so damn much. And we are all so proud of that. And shame on you, Canadians, for not following through. But listen, so now Churchill is the founder of America. And now we're living basically in Cecil Rhodes' dream. You know, the founder of Rhodesia, he wrote what's called, have you ever read The Confession of Faith? And this is in his, basically went along with his will when he left the money to found the roundtable groups and the Rhodes scholarships and all of this. His dream was to reunite the British and American empires. And he says, have you ever felt murderous? Oh, how I hate those founding fathers who declared independence from England. How they were, you know, he doesn't call them the founding fathers, but whatever, the American founding generation that declared independence, because you know what happened after that? Horrible N-word mud people like, you know, the Germans came and polluted North America with their dysgenic mud people, N-word stock. You know how the Germans are compared to the English, right? This is the racial thinking of the late 1800s in England, I guess. And so he says the primary object of the British Empire shall be to reunite with America and use America's might to remake the world a better place. To give you, as our Constitution says here, a republican form of government, right? We're going to give you a judge in a black robe and a regular election and a parliament and a rule of law. And that was what the same thing that the British used as their excuse to take over the entire world previously. And the idea was we're going to need America's support to continue this project, to remake the world.
Stuff you brought some point that some detail that I didn't know. So.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Please continue.
So, yeah, I mean, this is the foundation of the Royal Institute for International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations after World War I is to essentially unite American and English foreign policy. It's the Anglo-American establishment, again, you know, is what Carroll Quigley called it. And so this is, you understand, this is like a real affront to the real founding myth of America. The original founding myth of America is George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson said, no, screw you. We want to be free. We don't want to be part of the British Empire. We want to do our own thing without you. And no taxation without representation, man. And they overthrew that. And they said, no, the best thing America ever did was give up its independence and reunite with England in order to fight the world wars on the European continent, right? Or especially the second one. So to call that into question is to, you see, that calls the entire foundation of the modern American state and our entire relationship with Europe and everything else into question. Not that I'm saying we should be enemies of England. Hell, we could even be treaty allies with England, all other things being equal, and I probably wouldn't mind too damn much. But things are, you know, a lot different than, things are much further than that. Our relationship is much deeper than that, let's say.
Yeah.
But so then there's another thing, and this is worth bringing up about Daryl here because it's obviously a huge part of this conversation. It can't go unsaid. It's a huge part of it, and that is the Holocaust. And he brought up the Holocaust, or he didn't. I don't know exactly how it came up in the conversation, but I can tell you that it was misconstrued because what he said was, and I think people didn't make as much of a big deal about this, although some people did bring it up, but they didn't really analyze it in any kind of detail in a real way to refute, I guess. They just sort of said, oh, he's a Holocaust denier or some kind of thing. That wasn't what happened, man. What happened was, and he didn't not use these words, but he did clarify with me that this clearly is what he was talking about, okay? What he was essentially doing was he had just finished trashing Churchill and England. Now he was changing and saying, that's not to say the Germans were good guys. Okay, so people were taking the clip as though he was still talking about why England was the bad guys. And here's an example of him like playing down German evil. No, he was playing up German evil was the context of the statement. He was saying, now that I just said things about England, let me tell you about how bad Hitler's Germany was. And then he's saying something bad about them. Now, if you cut all that out, you can really manipulate the context of the understanding of his statement.
Yes.
And it's a little bit his fault for not being entirely clear about what he meant. And then the subject changed to Palestine and it never went back. He was never able to really clarify exactly what he meant. So I will help and I will clarify, okay? What he was saying was, even if you are pro-German, and even if you are some kind of like right-wing revisionist trying to play down the Holocaust, even you have to admit that when they invaded the East, they took possession of millions of people with no plan for what to deal with them, who were certain to be starved to death. They're being conquered and occupied and bombed and destroyed. They're all being taken out of work. Nobody's farming anything. Nobody's harvesting anything. Nobody's buying and selling anything. These people are going to die automatically. And no matter what, that's on you because you launched the war. And so he wasn't saying that's all the Holocaust ever amounted to. He was not saying anything like that. He was saying, you Holocaust revisionists, even you SOBs have to admit that it was at least millions of people were starved to death and that you can't blame that on the weather. That's because of Germany's national government's executive decisions, period. Right? That's what he was saying. And they go, oh, when he implied that no one was shot in the Holocaust. And it's like, no, he did not either. You inferred that as a matter of aggressive misunderstanding, right? That's what Eric Garris calls it. Aggressive misunderstanding. I refuse to take you in the proper context and understand what you meant to say. And only I will take your words to mean what I wish you had said so that I can be mad about it. You know, screw that, man. Daryl Cooper is, and he went on to explain I think in Dave's interview or in Tom Wood's interview, that, dude, Holocaust deniers are stupid, dude. They don't know what they're talking about. And you know what they are? He said, they're like kids who worship the devil, right? Because they were raised like really Catholic or really Baptist and they're rebelling against their overbearing dad. So now like they don't just listen to death metal, but they like believe in it. Whatever, dude. Like no one's impressed. No one cares except your tiny little sect, right? No one cares. Daryl paid zero respect to Holocaust deniers, dude. It totally just explained how that was ridiculous. It's crazy. What are you telling me? 40 million people died in the East, but not the people the Nazis hated the most and wanted to kill the most? Like, how could that be, dude? Don't be stupid, you know? So the man was just completely unfairly maligned. And I'll go further than that. If you go back and listen to his great podcast on Israel-Palestine, and I don't know if you've ever heard, it's called Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem.
I haven't listened to it yet, but I think I downloaded it. It's on the list.
Okay, well, so I'm not going to ruin it for you, but I'll tell you two things about it, okay? In the podcast, he demands, this is the frame of the thing, okay? He insists that the listener put themselves in the shoe of this random schmuck who's about to watch his wife get killed in front of him, and then he's going to get killed. And now you're him. And now you're laying there in the dirt watching them beat your wife and child to death. Now you understand what it's like to go through this. He tells a story like that. He makes you part of it. He makes you a Jew in Russia suffering through the pogroms in the 19-teens, just as well as he makes you a Palestinian suffering at the hands of Zionists in Palestine. There's no question whatsoever about the man's empathy or his ability to empathize and sympathize with the people that he's talking about. And if you listen to him describe and demand that you put yourselves in the shoes of a poor Jewish peasant being murdered in a pogrom, you won't think he's an anti-Semite and a Holocaust denier after that, dude. No, you won't. And he actually has a whole segment about Babi Yar. And I don't know if you know about Babi Yar, but this is a massive ravine outside of Kiev And in September of 41, the Nazis murdered something like 30,000 Jews of Kiev. Rounded them all up, told them they were going to get on a train, bring all your possessions with you, whatever. Then they stripped them naked, shot them in the head, and dumped them in a ditch.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a famous survivor of that named Dina. It's Pranachev, I believe. Pranovich or Pranachev. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Anyway, so she survived because she didn't really look Jewish. She was very blonde-headed and blue-eyed, I guess, and she convinced them that she wasn't Jewish, and she sat there and watched the massacre all day long, including her family. And at the end, they decided she'd seen too much and threw her in the, shot her and threw her in the ditch anyway, or maybe they just threw her in the ditch, and then left her for dead, and she escaped. And she told the story many times over many years and extremely consistently. Like, I read these great historians analyzing her statement and all this. It's totally true, right? For any doubters, screw you. This is totally true what happened to this woman. And Daryl reads word for word one of the versions of her statement. Like, she gave the statement numerous times over the years in front of tribunals and different things, whatever. But he read one of these statements in full.
Yeah, but I think he talked about it. I think it's either in your interview with him or the interview he made with Dave Smith. I think in one of the two he relayed what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's Pranachev. I think it's Dina Pranachev, or it's something like that. Anyway, but yeah, that's totally true. And you listen to it, and then he reads another one where, and I'm not spoiling it because you'll want to hear it anyway. He reads another one where it's a man who talks about how he sprung his father from the concentration camp. It was like near enough to the town. Mm-hmm. And this guy was able to go and get his father out of the camp and bring him home. And then his father went back and turned himself in and went back to the concentration camp to be killed, and left a letter to his son and said, I can't stand to divide crumbs with you, son. I'm going to go die. You live. And Daryl's reading this. You can hear his voice cracking as he's reading this thing.
Yeah.
But I'm supposed to, I hate this man because the Washington Post told me what I'm supposed to know about what he thinks and knows and says and feels about all this stuff that he never even had a chance to address on the Tucker Show. All they do is and listen, man, let me tell you something. Like, if you want to go around inferring the worst about what somebody meant about something, like, fine, you're a dick, but go ahead and do that. But to do that about the Holocaust, to say, oh my God, you know what? I heard a guy say 6 words and I'm pretty sure what he said was it didn't happen, but he wished it did. Ugh. You know what? That's not fair to do to somebody, man. That's not okay to do to somebody. That could really destroy somebody's life. For all you know, he has Jewish family members who are going to believe this about him when they see the news, and they're going to freak out, and it's going to ruin his life. It's going to ruin his marriage. You don't know, People don't know what they're doing. He could lose his job. The guy that runs the factory that he works at could get a phone call. I heard that you have a horrible Hitlerian on your staff, and he could lose his ability to take care of his family, and you're wrong. You don't even know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. This is a guy who did more to tell the Jew side of the story in the Holocaust in the last, 5 years than anybody, right? More people have heard his podcast talking about what it's like to be a Jew murdered by the Russians or murdered by the Germans. Like, more people heard Daryl Cooper explaining that in the last, say, half a decade, or I guess that came out in 2015. So in the last decade, Daryl has done more probably to enhance humanity's understanding of that situation than any other person. How do you like that? And they want to accuse him of being a Holocaust denier. And why? Because he attacked Churchill, perpetrator of many Holocausts.
Exactly, yes.
And so, yeah. So now let's get to the whole stupid war, okay? I think I defended my buddy here. Here's the thing with the war. First of all, and this has to be said, okay, it was all Woodrow Wilson's fault. Okay, everybody knows about World War I, and everybody knows it was all Russia's fault and Germany's fault and France's fault and the Ottomans' fault and England's fault. The English gave a secret war guarantee to France. Well, how the hell is that going to deter the Germans when they never heard of it? Stupid. Like the whole thing was just terrible. But it was over and it was a stalemate. Nobody won. Woodrow Wilson had this famous and important phrase. He said, "What we seek is peace without victory." He's such an idealist intellectual from Princeton University. He doesn't want to go over there and conquer Europe. He wants to set it free and help create the rule of law and make everything wonderful and all of this. But here's the deal. We had peace without victory. And it wasn't based on ideals. It was based on the fact that every army involved was exhausted and wanted out of it. The soldiers had no shoes. They had no ammunition. They were, you know, it was absolute hell on earth. And everyone wanted to quit, where the border had barely changed. Like there were Germans in France, but just barely. I guess they were in Lorraine or whatever, but they weren't like occupying France in any major way, only in a negotiable way, right? Like the treaty could have taken care of. You move your men back to here, whatever. Everyone was ready to quit. And then Woodrow Wilson got America involved and joined the side of Britain and France and tilted the scale against Germany so bad that the British and the French were able to inflict the Versailles Treaty on them. Now, but before that, in fact, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Before that, what Woodrow Wilson did was he sent tens of millions of dollars, and including trucks and guns and ammunition, to Alexander Kerensky, who had inherited the original revolution in March of 1917. And Wilson said, here's all this money that you need even to get by at all, but plus all this trucks and military equipment and whatever, if you promise to stay in the war and keep the Germans divided. And so Kerensky stayed in the war, which completely undermined his rule and support. And then on their fourth try, Lenin and Trotsky were able to seize power in a coup in October. Okay, that was on Woodrow Wilson. That would have never happened if he had not got in and Kerensky was able to pull his forces back, just for one, to defend him, right? And plus, just to end the radicalization that the brutalities of the war were causing among the population. And so if it hadn't been for Woodrow Wilson intervening to keep Russia in World War I, there would have never been communism. There would have never been a Soviet Union. Then also, then I mentioned the Versailles Treaty. Now, the Versailles Treaty, first of all, it bankrupted Germany and it forced them to accept full responsibility for the war and pay complete reparations to Britain and France that they could never pay. The American people paid it. America bailed out Germany so Germany could bail out Britain and France so that Britain could bail out J.P. Morgan and the American companies who would finance their armaments.
The Dows and the Young plans, I think.
Yeah, you probably know better than me on the specifics there, but I do know. Yes, and that sounds right. And this of course caused the hyperinflation, which didn't last the whole time. Sometimes people think like the hyperinflation lasted until 33 or whatever, but that's not the case.
It was
but it doesn't matter.
1 year.
Yeah, but it was enough.
In 1924, they went. Germany had a new mark that was more stable.
Right, but it was enough that it had completely wiped out the savings of anybody who had their savings denominated in the previous currency. It
angered, it angered and radicalized most of the people. Yes.
Right. And something that, and this is all in the great book by James Powell called Wilson's War. And this is something that they did not teach me in government school. They taught about the Versailles Treaty and the money.
I just take the book.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So there's something that they don't emphasize in government school, although I'm sure if you read any decent book about it, they talk about this, is they really stripped all of these territories from Germany, including, what's now still in northern Italy, the South Tyrol, which is, really German land and whatever. And then, they created Czechoslovakia out of part of Germany. They gave part of it to Poland, including the city of Danzig and all of this stuff. And this was a huge part of the reason, first of all, for the motivation of the Nazi Party to come to power, but for the tolerance of the people of Germany for the Nazis' radicalism. Because you know, the German people are not like what? Just what, genetically predisposed to support raving madmen? You know, that's not what's going on here, right? What happened was he was promising vengeance. He was promising justice and to make right what had gone wrong. And he would begin, as Powell says in there, he began almost every speech denouncing what he called the traitors of 1918. And those were the people who had signed the Versailles Treaty. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, the worst person who ever lived. He insisted that the German militarists who had got Germany into the war and had lost it, that, well, you don't negotiate with evil, right? Like Dick Cheney. You don't talk to bad people like that. So what did he do? He insisted that the German Democrats, who had not been responsible for the war, that they be allowed to come to power, and then that they be the ones to sign the treaty. So instead of making the guilty Germans sign the treaty, or at least the responsible ones, if you want to take the morality out of it or whatever, but the ones who had been in charge of it, he made the Democrats take responsibility for signing the treaty that gave away everything. And so then the Nazis rose to power denouncing that, right? Yeah. Everybody in the center and to the left of that are traitors to Germany, according to this guy. And it sounded plausible enough to people who lived through it. And then, so here, let me just say real quick too. I am not a World War II scholar. I know that you must have read many more books about this than me. And I mostly learned about World War II when I was a kid. And actually the only, well, that I can think of, well, okay, that are like more or less about World War II in general. I've read more specific books about specific things that happened during the war, right? But like about the war in general, or in generaler terms, I've only read revisionist history. I haven't read a lot of mainstream stuff about World War II. I might find it very convincing. I don't know. But I have read A.J.P. Taylor on the origins of the Second World War. I've read Human Smoke by Nicholson Baker. And I really encourage people to read this book, especially. It's just news clippings. And he did such a great job of putting together all of these news clippings from the time leading up to American entry into the war. And man, it is something else. It is just, there's so much context to be gleaned from that thing. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, would be Pat Buchanan's Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. And I don't know if you can see in the video here, but there should be quotes around the unnecessary war, or at least there's on the inside flap or whatever, because that is a direct quote from Winston Churchill. And in fact, he said it to FDR. He goes, well, I guess that was an unnecessary war. Do you have the quote there?
No.
Okay. I actually checked this after Darryl got in trouble. I went back and looked, and I actually found, and the quote is not just Churchill, it's Churchill talking to Roosevelt and saying, jeez, I think maybe we shouldn't have done that. He goes, it looks like maybe we stuck the wrong pig.
Yeah, we killed a pig.
Oh my God, are you kidding me, dude? Like 60 million people just got killed. And he's talking about, now that I think about it, saving the Soviet Union and giving them all of the land east of the Elbe River. In retrospect, I guess you're going to have to build an American world empire to fight the Cold War against the commies now, he said in his Missouri speech.
Yeah.
The same guy. It was Churchill who announced the Americans' new Cold War against the Soviet Union. Yeah. In a speech in Missouri that Truman invited him to come and give. America's founding father, Winston Churchill. Now, to the just, the screwery of the war, I want to go back again to what I said before about if we're in 5th grade, the way that they teach this is that they don't say this exactly, but the implication is, you see how all the pictures are black and white? That means this is from a long time ago and there's nothing you can do about it. And all those people would be dead by now anyway. And this is just the history of the world. And it had to happen this way or it wouldn't have happened this way. This is World War II. Nothing else is inevitable. You must believe that this is the way that it had to be. And the thing is about when you read Human Smoke and when you read Pat Buchanan, I don't remember Taylor as well. I read that one probably 20 years ago. I read Buchanan and then certainly Baker more recently. That's just not true. It's just not true. And what you see is off-ramp after off-ramp after off-ramp to prevent the worst from happening, being ignored.
Yes.
Now, let me be charitable to the war party on this one, because after all, Hitler was not Saddam Hussein. He was Hitler, right? Like, it's not just name calling. He really was, and he had the most powerful army in Europe. And you know, it's worth taking seriously the other side's claims, which is that Churchill was wise enough to see that you can't make a deal like with a guy like this of any kind. He must be killed. He's too crazy. He's too violent. He's too dangerous. His ideology of Nazism must be absolutely carpet bombed off the face of the earth so it don't exist anymore. And you're telling me there were off ramps from the war? Well, good that Churchill didn't take them. He knew he couldn't fight the war himself. He knew he had to get the heroic Americans to come finally to help him heroically win. And that was what he finally heroically did, and stopped the horrible madman. And the thing is, there's enough truth in the horrible madman part about Hitler there that really sounds like it might be right. But the point that I want to make here is that so much of that is hindsight. We're talking about, we measure Hitlerian evil not on the beginning of the Holocaust on Kristallnacht, right? We measure the evil of the Nazis on the final results of the war. But now we're begging the whole question, right, about the war itself. And so it was the same Nazis who did the war, right? It's not, you know, we know it was them, but I'm just saying the evil came, or that level of evil, the absolutely incomprehensible, must be obliterated off the face of the earth level of evil came during the war. So to say that's the cause of it, it's sort of like saying we entered the war to go end the Holocaust. No, we didn't. That is not what was going on, you know. And as I learned as a boy, if FDR had said, "Come on, everybody, let's go save the Jews from the Holocaust," they'd have hanged them on the White House lawn. That wasn't what the war was for. And they didn't even pretend that it was at the time. That's, you know, what they call retconning in TV shows, right? Where they like got to rewrite the story to figure out how to make it make sense. So they kind of retcon it. And so if we don't beg the question and assume the conclusion, and we're willing, at least for the sake of argument, to say, well, maybe the worst could have been avoided, and maybe the Nazis' opportunity to act as brutally as they ended up acting would have been constrained and limited if British foreign policy especially had been different, right? So this is, and you know, you notice Churchill's, the book, Churchill there, Pat Buchanan's book, it doesn't have FDR in the title. The book is about why Britain shouldn't have done this, right? The part about America coming in is later.
Yeah.
But what Buchanan is saying there is that Neville Chamberlain really screwed up, not in the mythology by refusing to just declare war after Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia in 1938, which they don't ever really say that exactly, but the implication is America should have helped England invade then, right? Yeah. But what happened was Chamberlain made a fool of himself, because he didn't just go over there and make a deal with Hitler that Hitler broke. He came home and he held the piece of paper over his head and he said, "I'm such a great leader, man. Look at me. I brought peace in our time. Nothing bad can happen now," right? So when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, he really made a fool out of Chamberlain. And in Buchanan's book, he cites all of, and by the way, Buchanan is a wonderful man. People sometimes would say that he was a pro-Hitler writer, whatever, too, and that is not true. It is absolutely not true. And that book is based, I believe, 100% on English historians' sources, right? He doesn't quote any Germans there other than by way of British historians from Oxford and Cambridge and the highest level of their historian schools quoting them, right? But like, none of this is telling in Pat's book. He's not telling it from Germany's point of view. He's telling it from the point of view of a wise British statesman instead of a fool. That's how he's telling the book, right? That is really worth the read, okay? But what he says is this. He goes, Chamberlain, in an emotional fit after being humiliated in Czechoslovakia, announced the war guarantee to Poland.
Yeah.
And when he did so, his own foreign minister, Lord Grey, freaked out and said the prime minister should be locked in an insane asylum. He said, how could you do this? What that means is you're going to now let the Polish colonels decide when we declare war. Exactly. And they are a bunch of fascist militarist colonels themselves, by the way. Speaking of Nazis who hate Jews, like these guys are not nice guys either.
No.
And they're reckless. And once we tell them that we got your back, which of course was not true, England had no ability to defend Poland from Germany whatsoever.
You're right.
But once we tell them that we got their back, we're making them braver. And that's exactly what happened. We don't know the counterfactual, but we know that the Polish colonels then told Hitler, yeah, screw you, pal. What are you going to do about it? And got braver, right? And then Hitler invaded. Now, and then here's the thing, too. Because of this war guarantee, which is in, I believe, March, could be April. I think it's in March of 39. Hitler knows that if he is going to go to Danzig, which he is, to reclaim this German city, that if he's going, that he's going to have a war with Britain and France. And he knows the Brits have forces in France. And so he knows that if he's going to be occupying Poland and possibly facing down Stalin in the east, he has to protect his rear. So what does he do? He sends his diplomat to go and sign the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Yeah. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so here you have oil and water, right? Here you have matter and antimatter in the Nazis and the communists. The British force them essentially to make peace with each other, forces Hitler to make peace with Stalin so that he can destroy all of the Western democracies first. And conquer and destroy all of Europe first. And then 2 years later, go ahead and go to war against the Soviet Union anyway. Okay? Now, so what was gained by doing that? And especially when what the British do, they hightailed it at Dunkirk. They had no ability to keep the Germans out of France. The French lost almost immediately, were, under an occupation government. The British had to flee. Their entire war plan was, we'll get America to come. We'll hope Stalin can stay in the war long enough, and then we'll get America and Canada to come and finish the fight for us, because he knew that they couldn't do it. But at the same time, he knew that Germany couldn't invade Britain and that they had no ability to. They'd already won the Battle of Britain, like early on I'm sorry, I forget when, but by what, like mid 41 or whatever, the German bombers were shot down. There was nobody else coming. They certainly had not built up a naval force that could cross the English Channel and attempt to occupy England. They couldn't. People would say, I would be speaking German in Texas right now. Not just that you French would be, French Canadians and actual French would be speaking German right now, but we all would be speaking German right now. They couldn't even cross the English Channel. Yeah. They weren't coming here. They weren't even really a threat to England.
But so I just think they had no intention. For me, Hitler represents German imperialism in a paradigm where they are in competition with British, French, and US imperialism. They are all bad guys. But for me, it's clear Germany didn't want war with the West. Their imperialist ambition was in the East. Right. I think it's evil. Don't support that. But for me, they were not worse than what the British had done before. But I think the episode of Dunkirk, for me, what it's shown is that I think it's clear that Hitler ordered his troops to let the British go because he really wanted to make peace. there's no doubt we know Hitler was evil, but I think that he sincerely didn't want war with Britain, and to show, I think, his good faith on that, he let 300,000 British soldiers go back to Britain in order to be able to make peace. And from a military,
he did try to sue for peace over and over again, right? Through radio broadcasts and through dropping leaflets, even over London, which, you know, Churchill had his men go and clean up off the streets before anybody could find them and read them. But look, okay, so I don't want to assume my own conclusion either, right? Because the fact, as you say, that the fact that he had no intention of going west, which I agree with, that in itself doesn't mean that it was wrong for the Western democracies to identify him as such a danger that he needed to be destroyed. Like, it's possible that there's such a thing as like a Hitlerian evil that must be killed, right? But if you look at this, if you look even from that point of view, I think if you go back and take a critical examination of the run up to this whole thing, that you just can't help but see all of the flaws in the policy and all of the different escape hatches where things could have been made much better for many more people. I mean, for one thing, the blockade that Churchill, and again, as I say, the Germans didn't even try to build a navy to challenge British rule of the seas. They knew the British ruled the seas, and that was how it was going to be. But the blockade on Europe was so total that no one could get out. He wouldn't, Churchill would not let any civilians out. So even when the Germans are saying, let us kick these people out, they would not allow anyone. So
they blockaded the Jewish immigration in the 1930s. I think that the British Navy shot at a ship bringing Jews to Palestine, something like that. I mean, how can
FDR turned them away too. FDR turned them away from the United States, and not just Jews, but like all kinds of civilians too. And in fact, in Nicholson Baker's book, the only heroes in there are the Quakers, because they're sneaking into Europe to bring people food, right? Who are just so desperate. It's the worst circumstance anybody could be in, and the absolute lack of humanity on the part of Churchill during that. Okay, so here's what we're talking about though, right? During this time frame, we're talking about after the invasion of Poland, but before, and maybe even after the invasion of the Soviet Union, but before the attack on Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war on the United States, right? We're talking about in that time where the West is not fighting on the ground against Germany. They're biding their time and waiting for D-Day and all of this, right? Hadn't happened yet. America hadn't even been attacked at Pearl Harbor yet. So during this time, you know, the Blitzkrieg had taken the West. So it's like the war in the West is essentially over, right? Well, I mean, there's French resistance and whatever, but it's essentially an occupation and low-level insurgency in the West. And then at this time, and this is the thing too, and this is something goes back to something Daryl said that I shouldn't have omitted. I think this is important. Daryl's context for talking about the Germans here is he goes at one point, he goes, geez, I didn't really realize I had to say that German Nazis are bad. You know what I mean? Like we all sort of already agree with that, I think. You know what I mean? What he's talking about, he makes the analogy to some criminal strung out on meth, holding his own family hostage. And the cops are outside. So the cops are FDR and Churchill. And the meth head, insane paranoiac inside is Hitler. Now, you know that he's strung out on methamphetamines. You know that he's out of his mind. You know that he's holding all these civilians hostage in there. So the question is, what you, officer, are going to do to try to de-escalate this thing and end it in the most opportune way for everyone involved, and not just drive it straight to murder-suicide. And what Daryl says is, he goes, if we have a crime scene like this, and then we come to find out that the cops were just joking about how fun it would be to drive this guy to do something crazy, and how they absolutely refused to negotiate with him in good faith, and how they did nothing but call him names and insult him and dare him to kill his wife because they don't think he's got the courage or what, then you would have a real problem with that. That's not how they're supposed to do it. No one's taking the side of the meth head who's holding his own son hostage inside, dude. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether the sheriff did a good job or not. And he didn't in this case. And here, and this is in Baker. is Hitler says, if America comes, I'm going to kill all the Jews. If you come, he's holding them all hostage. And he believes, because he's strung out on meth and he's completely crazy, he believes there's something called the Jews that controls America and Britain, and that if he holds millions of them hostage, then the ones that control America and Britain will back off and not get them killed, right? And so he publicly announces this over and over again. So here Daryl is going, now did Churchill play this right? If that's the circumstance, if this guy's saying, listen, I'm willing to kill millions of civilians, dude. I'll happily kill millions of civilians if you cross these lines and whatever. Hey, might you have found a better way to negotiate? Might there have been a better way to handle this thing? And what could it, and you know, Donald Rumsfeld said that, I was saving this for the Tucker show, but I don't know if I'll ever get a chance to go on there.
I hope so much you go there.
Well, so Donald Rumsfeld said that Winston Churchill was the George W. Bush of his time. No, actually what he said was that George W. Bush was the Winston Churchill of his time. Yeah. But I'm saying, okay, well, if that's true, then that means that Winston Churchill was the George W. Bush of his time.
Kind of.
And now, wait a minute. It's starting to make sense, right? That what George Bush thought was so inevitable actually was not. What George Bush thought was so important for him to do was actually really stupid. And he really should not have been listening to his hawkish advisors. He should have really thought it through. And I can see a lot of W. Bush in Winston Churchill. And I think when you read Buchanan, you'll be like, yeah, that's what this is, dude. Right? Again, back to fifth grade. In fifth grade, when they teach this stuff, Truman and Roosevelt and all their advisors, these are really smart guys, and they're really good guys, and they're really wise guys, and they really are doing the right thing because they know what to do so well and all of that. But if you, and that makes sense to you because you're a little kid and they're grown-ups and it's all black and white pictures from a long time ago. So like, I don't know, sure. But now that you're a grown-up and you see politicians your whole life around you and you see how they are, yeah, and you just transpose anybody that you know of from major American politics in or British politics and transpose those personalities onto the situation during World War II. So now it's not the FDR that you don't really know. Now it's George W. Bush making these same decisions. Yeah. Or now it's Tony Blair. Yeah. Is the one who goes, I think we should give a war guarantee to Poland. And you go, wait a minute. Like, and in fact, even just thinking Neville Chamberlain, we're supposed to despise Neville Chamberlain as the most idiotic, like horrible diplomat and least wise person in foresight and whatever in the world. Well, he's the guy that gave the war guarantee to Poland. Yeah. Not Churchill. So if he's such an idiot, maybe he is an idiot. Maybe you're right. And he really sucked at being prime minister. And we need to examine also other of his decisions besides just that one that you don't like very much, you know? And I think that if you look at it from fresh eyes and you go back and look at it, you go, oh, okay. The fifth grade point of view here, where, well, first there was World War I, and then there was World War II, and then there was the Cold War, and all the history of the things, and all this is all so inevitable. I think you'll see how, yeah, no, it wasn't. And if FDR, if Churchill himself is the one who coined the phrase unnecessary war, then at the very least, people who are upset by that ought to hear him out.
Yeah, and go read that book.
That's right. What's Churchill's case against himself? Yeah. Darryl Cooper said that Churchill made mistakes. Churchill said he made mistakes. Yeah. What were they? What are we talking about? You know, where does that come from? How in the world, of all people, how could it be that Churchill said that he screwed that up? That he screwed up World War II? The good war? Which, by the way, I meant to say this at the beginning. The phrase, the good war, that comes from the historian Studs Terkel, the great American historian Studs Terkel. And he was being sarcastic and ironic and saying how crazy it was that we're supposed to think of this as the good war, when hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed, tens of thousands of Canadians were killed, by the way, in the war. And And millions, tens of millions of people were killed all across Europe and whatever. We're only supposed to remember this in the most positive light and never supposed to question how it came to be this way. But if you think about everything else that you know about FDR and Truman, they're not the caricatures that you were taught in 5th grade. They were extremely flawed men. And so were all the men around them too.
Yeah. But
you know?
look, you mentioned how Hitler was mad, that he was evil, that we all know that. But what's the difference between what Hitler did and, on the other side, Churchill, who also is responsible for the death of millions of people in the British colonies and the war itself? It's that those people, for me, I see them as much as evil as Adolf Hitler. It's just that because they live in a democracy, they have to appear, they have to appear good. They have to give a show that they are good people, but they're a psychopath like Hitler. At least Hitler doesn't have to do that show. He can be honest and say the thing that he says. He doesn't have to do a political show like under a democracy.
Yep. And he did say all along what his intent was, but to go back to the context of the time, the question never had anything to do with, like, in the councils of leadership in England and in the United States. The question was never, the Germans are so evil that we have to stop them. Their political system is so undemocratic that we have to stop them. That wasn't it. What it was the British doctrine that had been adopted by the Americans as well, that no one power should be able to dominate continental Europe.
Yeah.
And if anyone does try to, then Britain invades or backs someone or supports someone to keep them off balance and to keep the thing churning, right? To prevent that from happening. It's the same reason that they allied with Germany against France under Napoleon. And they said the same thing over and over and over again. Okay, this is to prevent German domination of Europe, not for humanitarian reasons, but for the reasons that it would limit British influence over that same continent.
There's
a huge part. Yeah.
There's a word. It's imperialism. World War II was an imperialist war. It was a world war, I would say, started by British imperialism against German imperialism in Europe.
And look, this is a big part of American policy against Russia right now.
Yeah, imperialism.
It's to prevent Germany and Russia from dominating Europe together and potentially keeping America and Britain out. Yeah. That's their nightmare, is to have an alliance. Now, see, from my point of view, and I guess yours and any like regular decent human being who's not an imperialist, you would think that, well, geez, if the last 2 times that Germany and Russia fought, it was the worst thing that ever happened, then maybe we want not necessarily an alliance, but at least a very tight economic and political friendship between these 2 countries. We should support pipelines between them. We should support them because we would want to prevent the worst of all things from happening, war. But if you listen to the war party talk, they say no. Angela Merkel's Eurasian home, that is the threat. And the threat where Bastiat says, and this is actually not a real quote, I was bummed to find out, but where Bastiat supposedly said where goods do not cross borders, soldiers will, they say, oh no, where goods do cross borders, soldiers won't. And so if Germany and Russia have too tight of an economic relationship, then that would mean that Germany would not be as willing to go to war with Russia as we want them to be. And they literally talk about it that way. Mm-hmm. That's who runs the American empire now.
Yeah. Many people laugh at me, especially among the libertarian and so-called libertarian, because since I used to be a Marxist, I remember people laughing at me because they said that I was using too much the word imperialism. So they made joke about me because imperialism is a word that Marxists use a lot.
Sure. Right. And you know what? yes, and that's an important point. I like to point out, Pat Buchanan calls it imperialism, and Pat Buchanan ain't no pinko, and that's and that ain't in that book, right? I mean, this is, you know, in whatever other context, it is what it is, and you could even say, look, imperialism has strict definitions, and you know, depending on which dictionary you check, right? And so does even neo-imperialism. And I think, like, I've heard it argued that you have to call this a neo-imperialism because it's actually different than the strict definition even of neo-imperialism, where it's like we come in and extract all your resources or whatever. In America's, really, we just tax the crap out of you. We'll let you run your own resources, but we just steal all the profit, and just we forced you to allow our guys to come in and buy up 51% of your mining company or whatever it is. But it's like, it's a little bit different. It's a lot more CIA coups, a lot more black bag jobs, a lot more political influence, and a lot less colonialism, right? George Bush didn't move the whites of Alabama to Baghdad, right? That wasn't what was going on there. It was a level of control. And so, and yeah, it's true that the communists did wear out that word and make it sound like, oh, you're just an ideologue and you're just against America or whatever. When there are enough right wingers who have called it an empire and have called the disease that we're suffering, imperialism and militarism, enough that it's okay, right? Chalmers Johnson wrote a book called Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic. And before that, Sorrows of Empire. And he was a hardcore Cold Warrior from USC and from the CIA. He was a CIA analyst, and he supported the Cold War all the way through to the end. And then when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union fell apart and the American empire didn't, he was like, wait, what? This is the same thing. For people who don't know, this is the same thing with Pat Buchanan, Scott McConnell, Jude Wanniski. And Jude Wanniski had been a commie. He was a neocon. The rest of these guys were just cons. But when the Cold War ended, they said, come home. The Soviet Union was the emergency. And now that the Soviet Union is gone, that's it. Abolish NATO, bring our troops home, cash that peace dividend, and let's get back to work. Let's have a limited constitutional republic and be free. And you had this whole group of paleo conservatives who had supported the Cold War against the Reds, but then demanded that the empire stick by its promise. The emergency's over. Now come home, Emperor Palpatine, right? And then Bush Sr. said, no, we're going to the Middle East. We're expanding NATO into Eastern Europe. We're expanding in Asia.
The cause, you said imperialism, may mutate and change over time to adapt to the reality. I agree with that. But fundamentally, imperialism, as a libertarian, I will say it's one of the main root causes, because the state intervened in the economy. So not the capitalist, not the free market, the crony capitalist used the state to gain market resource, all that, through the violence of the state, through imperialism, instead of the free market. Lenin, in his book, Imperialism, the Supreme State of Capitalism, has a good point. He explained that the merge of capitalism and the state together lead to imperialism. Of course, his solution is wrong, but it's fundamentally imperialism as libertarian. It's because the state intervened in the economy.
Right. In fact, we published a book by Keith Knight at the Institute called Domestic Imperialism. 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism.
I have one of his book, but I don't have that book yet. I will buy it.
It's great. And I just love that term, because it's just such a great way to describe the U.S. government at home. It's the same imperialism you oppose abroad, inflicted on the 50 states. Why are we tolerating this stuff? It's insane.
So just to conclude on World War II itself, my conclusion is that the West should not have intervened in World War II against Hitler in 1939-40. And if that would have been the case, I know it's speculation, but I'm pretty sure what would have happened is that there would have been a war between Hitler and Stalin. Mm-hmm. The two would have weakened themselves. Hitler would never have been able to conquer all of Russia. He would probably have dominated, I would say, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and that. After that is our, I think that Stéphane Molyneux said most of the young men would have died, so he would not have been a threat to the rest of the world. And me, I'm pretty sure in that scenario, the Holocaust would not have happened, or it would have been reduced in size, right? Because all the West had to do, I would say, two things. Okay, you can have you can have an army to defend yourself, no problem with that, and you just let the refugee come. So you have
right, there would have been the West for them to escape to, right?
Yeah. So that scenario, which is the libertarian non-interventionist, for me, it would have saved the life of tens of millions of people.
Yeah.
Western Europe would not have been occupied.
And there'd have never been Mao Zedong, and there'd have never been
because
Kim Il-sung or Ho Chi Minh.
Exactly, because as the biggest unintended consequences of World War II is that in Europe, most of the territory occupied by Hitler in Eastern Europe are given to Stalin and become communist. But not only, after that, Stalin is able to help Mao Zedong in 1949, and Mao Zedong was also helped by the United States government during the war against Japan. And Mao Zedong, according to some people, just in China, it's like 60 million deaths. So the death toll of World War II is done a second time in China because of communism. So it's another unintended consequence of the war in Europe. Stalin, because if Stalin doesn't help Mao in 1949, probably communism doesn't win. So
Yeah, and then of course that's the foundations of the American empire. As soon as we're done allying with the Soviet Union to destroy Germany and Japan, we ally with Germany and Japan against the Soviet Union. And nobody's supposed to notice, right? This was Orwell's joke about, oh, now we're at war with East Asia, and now we're at war with Eurasia. Like, they really did do that to the American people. The Soviets, we hate them. We just told you that they were our best friends in the whole world last year. But this year, we hate their guts. And now the Germans and the Japanese are going to help us contain their sorry asses. And Americans were like, okay, I mean, I guess if you say so. And so they had a whole Cold War. They killed, something like 2 million Koreans and 3 million Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians fighting the wars there. They kicked over the domino in Cambodia that led to Pol Pot and another 3 million killed by him, and the entire Cold War. So that would include then all of the green light to Suharto for his genocide in East Timor, and the green light to what's his name in Pakistan to kill all the people in Bangladesh and whatever. There's a million of them, dude. The whole history, the Guatemalan War, they did a coup in Guatemala that led to a civil war where 500,000 people were killed. And this, it just goes on and on and on. Of course, the threat of communism in Iran was the excuse to overthrow Mossadegh and lead to all of our problems and screwing around with the Persians in the Middle East this whole time. So the whole foundations of the American empire come from this same thing, from cleaning up the mess of the last thing that we did. And again, it's a
vicious circle.
Yep, and it just goes on.
But as libertarian, for me, what convinced me to become a libertarian, that was the non-aggression principle. In my autistic brain, when you fit in non-aggression principle, it's like a miracle. Everything become clear. And look, I'm open to that, to gray zone that sometimes, it's not perfect. But when you violate the non-aggression principle, which is, for me, it's an evil. Morally, it's simple. You don't violate that. But pragmatically, when you violate the non-aggression principle especially through the state, there is also unintended consequence.
Right.
So being a libertarian, for me, it's like it's both. It's the moral and pragmatic aspect of it, and we just show how it's evil, and the result of it pragmatically is absolutely terrible. So now I would like, just before we end this wonderful and amazing conversation, I would like to ask you some specific question about World War II. Is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I would I would like to know, and let's try to be brief. What was your what was the process for you to, because I guess you were not always a World War II revisionist. Is there something that happened in your life, in your development, that made you become a World War II revisionist? Because for me, what happens. I like to tell that little story. But when I was a kid, my parents got divorced, lived with my mother, and in the entry of our apartment, there was a little bookshelves, and there were two books on the shelf. And those two books scared me. One of the books was the novel Holocaust, and the other was The Man from Magadan, which is a book about the Soviet Gulag. And on the cover of the book, there's a face of a man that looked like a zombie. That was scary. I was 6 years old in 1981 looking at this. And I asked my mother, what are those books about? And she said, oh, there was a long time back, it was 1981, there was some long time ago, there was some people that put Jews into gas chambers, then burned them. Me, I was terrified, and I asked my mother, are they still doing that today? And she said, oh no, there was a war and our government beat them. So I said, oh my God, our governments are good, And the years go by, and in the mid 1980s came the movie Gandhi. Did you saw that movie?
Yes. Yeah.
And in the movie Gandhi, there is a scene where the British soldier fire at a peaceful crowd of Indian women and children. Look, it's horrible, the scene. He said British soldier with their rifle shoot women and children. That was traumatizing. And then a few years later, I got my first history class at school, and we learned, the World War II between the evil Nazis and the good democratic West, and the Nazi, the Holocaust, but whatever. And then I said, the good versus the evil. But I saw a movie where the British soldiers are shooting at women and children. But there was something, but I still thought that, nothing is perfect. And I became interested in politics after 9/11, but I became a leftist, a Marxist. So, and I remember going to the demonstration against the war in Iraq in 2003 in Montreal. It was a day that was very cold in February or March. And, I received leaflets against the war. Yeah, that's great. But, all those things were from leftists, whether it's Marxist and different kind of socialism. So I became a socialist. But even at that time, I was anti-war. I knew that at least World War II, we didn't have the choice. And it's not before I started to listen to Stéphane Molyneux that, for me, it's when I became a revisionist. But the seed was the scene in the movie Gandhi where the British soldiers shoot at people. And my mother, who told me when I was 6 years old about the Holocaust. And at that time, I thought that the book on the Soviet Gulag was for the death camp of Nazi Germany. Then later I realized, no, the other book was about the Soviet Gulag. And after I became a libertarian, I started to listen a lot to Lou Rockwell, to Antiwar.com, and I had a discussion with Brett Venot from the School Sock podcast in 2013. I don't like to travel, but I went to Portrait once just to meet Brett Venot. So that was my process. But is there something that happened in your life that made you become a World War II revisionist?
No, I don't remember any specific event other than just
being open-minded.
Like I told you before, when people become libertarians, they end up going back and rechecking all the wars, right? We go back and look at the Civil War and go, oh, well, what was really going on there? And we look at, hopefully the Mexican War too, but we certainly everybody hates Woodrow Wilson. Everyone blames Woodrow Wilson for blowing up everything. And then so now we're in the business of questioning all the wars. And I wasn't really raised a right winger. I was raised, I'm I think maybe a year younger than you. I was 5 in 81.
I'm 1 year older than you.
So
I'm born in 1975.
Yeah. So, I was raised in the shadow of the Vietnam War, and nobody believed in that. And I had met enough veterans, even as a kid, to know they didn't believe in it, and they had fought in it. And all the movies of that time were all kind of very revisionist, or I don't know, not all, but there was enough stuff about Vietnam and that whole era and that whole feeling of resentment over what had happened there and all that, it was all the homeless guys on the street. All of them had green flak jackets, right? Every single one of them was wrecked from Vietnam. That was why they were there. And I picked up on that from a very young age. So I kind of was always very anti-war. And then, as I was saying at the beginning, we all kind of saved World War II for last, because that's the one where America was the best and the enemy was the worst. And yet, if you really want to understand the truth about the history of the 20th century, you have to take a look at what happened there. Rothbard writes in Wall Street Banks and American Foreign Policy that American entry into World War II was just a compromise between the Morgans and the Rockefellers. The Morgans got to have their war in Europe, and the Rockefellers got to have their war in Asia. It's like nobody told the American people that, right? It's just like nobody said Iraq War II was all about, the Israelis want an oil pipeline to Haifa. Nobody told us that. It's the same kind of thing, right? With there's these kind of alternative agendas and all that. And of course, World War II is always told backwards. We know the very worst that all the Nazis did accomplish during the war. And so then we project all that to the beginning of the war and say this was the threat that had to be eliminated, when it was the elimination of them that actually helped to cause the problem that we cite. And so, it's very paradoxical and ugly and weird. And then, if there's one big thing, it would be, I guess, reading. Well, I think I read Taylor before Buchanan. I had read, I don't know who turned me on to that stuff, but reading Buchanan is really eye-opening. And I love Pat. He wrote for us for Antiwar.com for many years and is a supporter and is just a wonderful man. And so I was willing to hear it from him. You know what I mean? That all right, Pat, let's see what you got on World War II, which is just not my specialty, man. I'm just too young and I'm too busy hating Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and et cetera. And so I just have not really done the work on World War II nearly as much as I would like to someday. But look, if somebody told you that, hey, it turns out that what FDR did was wrong, that's probably right, isn't it?
I'm at the point where those two books, which we agree that both of the authors are not libertarians.
Right.
Pat is a paleo-conservative, and Nicholson is, I would say, a leftist pacifist. Mm-hmm. I'm at the point that everyone I know that is open-minded enough, I offer them freely the book. I already bought those books 4 or 5 times each just to offer them.
Yeah.
Okay. Just cool. Before we end, I had a list of questions, but I'm just going to ask 2 of you. First, do you know who is Ralph Raico?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Have you ever met him in person?
No. Oh, no, he died a couple years ago, I think. Now
he died in 2016 in December.
Oh, okay.
It's a man I wish I would have met to shake his hand and say, "I love you, Ralph. You're an heroic figure to me." Yeah. That man is a. Have you read that? Do you own that book?
No, I have not read that.
Okay, if you don't own it, after the talk, I'll send it to you freely.
All right,
it's
great.
A book. It's the Antiwar book by Ralph Raico. Okay, my last question. Okay, have you heard about that book, Death by Government?
Yes, okay. I've read that.
Okay, I want to be honest. I owned a lot of books that I haven't read.
I read that online years ago, and I don't think book. Yeah, I haven't read that yet either. I have that too. I have Freedom Betrayed behind me up there, and I haven't gotten a chance to read that yet. I'm sure it's great. But I honestly, I think Rummel's heart's in the right place, but I think his scholarship is pretty lousy. I think he takes, whenever you have 10 million dead, he doubles it or triples it just because he feels like it. And I don't really think it's... why bother with the highest end estimate of everything? You know what I mean? That couldn't possibly be right. And the truth is bad enough. But I shouldn't talk shit because I'm just mad at him because he supported Iraq War II. So I was like, screw you, Rommel, you're dead to me. Yeah. He became a liberventionist. Oh, we got to stop Saddam because Saddam is killing people, death by government. So somehow the biggest government in the history of the world going and launching a war is going to stop people from getting killed. Get the hell out of here. So like, you know what I mean? He might as well be a Building 7 scholar to me at this point. I don't care what he says, but I don't know. He may be okay. But yeah,
an argument I use often is, and that people hate it, even libertarian. And I know there's a nuance, and I prefer to live in a liberal democracy than under Nazi Germany. Okay?
Sure.
But I would have preferred to live in Nazi Germany in 1935 than in the Soviet Union. Because in Nazi Germany in 1935, if you're not happy, you can leave. You can own a limited form of private property, like we have today. I have a small farm. It took me 15 years to save money to buy a small farm, and I know that the governments can take it if he wants. I could do nothing, but I believe that the British Empire was not really better than Nazi Germany. If you look, because I know that Rommel on his website, he stated the four most killing, the four most murderer government of the 20th century, and Nazi Germany is in fourth place. The first two are Mao's China, Stalin's Soviet Union, and the third one is European colonialism that, according to him, would have killed 50 million people just in the 20th century. And Germany didn't own a lot of colonies in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's mostly the British and the French.
So I read a little bit about colonialism. Recently, I received a book, The Legacy of Violence, History
of cool. That looks interesting.
But I think the author is probably a leftist. But in Nicholson Baker, when he explained that in the Royal Air Force, the one who started to bomb German cities before Germany bombed the British cities, the Royal Air Force, they had experience. You know why? Because in the 1920s and 30s, they bombed village in Africa, India, and Iraq.
Yeah.
So the death toll of colonialism is pretty high. And now I know I will be hated for saying that. Why nobody knows about it? Is it because the people killed by the British empires were not Jews? Because I know that some Jews are ethnocentric, and they talk a lot, and they play the Holocaust card. And sometimes I say, hey, look, the Second World War killed 60 million non-Jews, also with the 6 million Jews. So it's sad for you, but it was 80 years ago. Can we just say that killing human beings is wrong? Because so for me, the British imperialism, French imperialism, they were competitor to the Nazis.
Right.
And so do you disagree with what I say?
No. No, that sounds right. Well, I don't know about the part about like where I'd prefer to live and all that. I wouldn't vouch for that. But the thing about the British Empire, as I said at the beginning, this used to be America's proud heritage, that we declared independence from them, even when our country was entirely dominated by Englishmen. They still hated them so much they overthrew the bastards. So,
in Quebec, there is a movement to separate Quebec from Canada. You heard about it?
On the same basis,
There are people in my family and my friends that are separatists, and for me,
they voted very close. They've had votes on it before that were very close.
In 1995, there was a referendum, and the no passed at 50.5%.
Wow.
But but for a lot of people in Quebec, that are nationalists and separatists, the problem, if things are not perfect in Quebec, it's not the fact that Quebec has the biggest welfare state of North America and we have the highest income tax of Canada. No,
Right.
it's because of English people. It's because of English.
And Russia.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, thank you, Manuel, for having me on, man. It's been great.
I was nervous because the interview before that. I was afraid that for me that
No, it's been great.
went even better than I thought. And so I gonna thank you very much. I wish you the best. Maybe we'll talk again in the future. If we had the opportunity to meet in person one day, I would be glad. But
me too.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, bud. Have a good one.
I stopped the recording.